Tuco the Rat here, and today I'm going to interview retired police officer Russ Holt about the 1930s gangster era. We're going to talk about the weapons and tactics that were used by the gangsters as well as the police, and some of the history that I never heard about before on this subject. So first of all, Russ, what can you tell me a little bit about your career as a police officer?
Retired law enforcement, 28 years. Patrols.
Okay.
Firearms instructor for 17 years. Police tactics, street survival.
Interesting. And you're kind of a historian on the gangster era,
yes.
The weapons and tactics and stuff. And first of all, what guns did the bad guys use versus the good guys? Were they using the same kind of guns?
A lot of their guns were picked up initially in armory robberies from National Guards. And those units were 1911s. They also had BARs, model 1918s, fully automatic 30-06 battle rifles. They pick up Thompsons in there as well. But the stuff they would buy on the streets, you could actually buy Thompsons back then prior to the NFA rules. They'd just go into a gun store and buy them there. Or they would buy the 1911 frame gun in 38 Super, which was the most powerful, highest velocity cartridge of the period. It was known to penetrate V8 car doors, current day ballistic armor, and was just a super penetrator.
About what year did that come out?
1933.
33. Well, right in the rural gangster area.
Correct.
Interesting.
In order to combat that, instead of law enforcement learning skills with semi-automatic, they Smith & Wesson built a law enforcement weapon, the 38-44 heavy. So it's basically a super hot 38 cartridge on a large frame to handle the extra powder. It never had the velocities of a 38 Super, but it did assist a little bit more in penetrating car doors and windshields of the era.
And when did that come out?
1935.
35. Interesting. When did the 357 Magnum come out?
They call them registered 357s, not because they were registered. It's when you bought one, Smith & Wesson registered it because there were so few that went out the door, and that would have been about 1937. It was not really a gainable firearm until after World War II.
Huh. Interesting.
Which then Smith & Wesson came up with what they called the Combat Masterpiece. Later on it was called the Model 19 in 357, 4-inch or 6, and it was very popular in law enforcement through the 60s, 70s, up until the 80s as a matter of fact.
Interesting. And so do you think the gangsters were outgunning the cops in the early days? Or?
Absolutely. Their tactics were straight on. They would attack heavy force in what we call takedown robberies. They had no regard for civilian casualties. Law enforcement would roll up bad tactics right on the bank. They would just simply open up. The Dillinger gang had a guy by the name of Babyface Nelson. The Dillinger gang had their own gunsmith, and their own gunsmith built Babyface a fully automatic, extended stock 38 Super on the 1911 with a snail magazine underneath it.
So how many rounds could it?
In the snail?
Yeah.
25 to 50.
Wow.
And imagine that at 1,200 to 1,300 feet per second burping out the window of a bank.
Wow. And he killed some FBI agents with that, I believe.
No, Babyface killed local law enforcement. He didn't get a fed in that.
Huh.
But when they found Babyface dead, after a robbery, he was wounded, and they kicked him out of the car, and he fell out of the car with his 38 Super. To this day, that weapon is in the FBI museum.
Wow.
As a trophy.
Yeah, he was a real fighter.
Anxious.
And kind of
very
aggressive,
very unprofessional.
Quick to kill. And
yeah, he had a low tolerance level. He wasn't stable enough to be doing what they were doing. They just stumbled through these robberies because there's very bad law enforcement. And like I said, their tactics, law enforcement's tactics, were very limited in their training. And after a robbery would happen, they had no problem going to 20 miles away and doing another one because there was no way to notify the other jurisdiction. There was no handheld radios. Mm-hmm. Morse code maybe, but there was no picking up the radio and calling somebody.
No kidding.
And they're running stolen cars on stolen plates. They just switched the plates. And
wow. So the police didn't even communicate in the same town on radios even? Or?
No.
Wow. And you mentioned briefly that they had their own gunsmith.
They did. They also had their own mechanics for the vehicles.
Wow. That travel with them, or they?
Well, yeah.
They would just go to them when
They go to them, or to mostly around the Chicago area or Minneapolis area. Yeah.
And we talked earlier about the body armor that the gangsters had, because the police didn't have any, and some of the gangsters actually had.
They got it at the same place. You just go down to the store and buy it. And this is
And that's what you have there.
This is a period correct one. This is an actual ballistic vest.
Can you stand it up and show it to the camera?
It is simply made of two-stage metal, so when you take a hit, it would move.
Huh. It overlaps a little bit there.
Yeah, and you get
Flexible.
pelvis protection here. It's very limited. I mean, this is not going to do much for you because stuff is going to come around and maybe hit you in the side or whatever. It's going to keep your vitals in okay shape, but
yeah, and it looks almost like a button-down.
yeah, like a shirt, like you're wearing something. This is certainly stop 38s and 45s. Rifle, forget it.
Yeah.
Any rifle would burn through this.
Huh. Interesting. And so what brought the rural gangster era to a close?
My opinion, mostly just World War II in general. You know, we weren't getting any better crime-wise. The 1930s was the highest peak in this country had seen in many, many years. Well, that violent since at least the 20s, but continuous. And there was more and more freelancers out there, and they were almost like today, they're being idolized because of the economy and the societal issues of the day. The war came and it all changed. Kind of like, remember 9/11?
Mm-hmm.
We all banded together, and
Yeah.
law enforcement could do no wrong, and our military was great, and we all loved one another, and we went after the enemy, and that's exactly what it was in World War II.
I see what you're saying, yeah. Interesting. Okay, Russ, tell me about what you got there.
It's a law enforcement memorial stone dedicated to my family and friends who served in the law enforcement field. My great uncle Art, who was a deputy sheriff, and then moved on to be a chief of security of a bank in Minneapolis, Minnesota in the 1930s, where the Dillinger gang would go and hide in St. Paul, where they had a hideout. And that's why my uncle and men like him, who were gun handlers and fighters from World War I, were hired by big banks. We started in 1892 with the whole family to current day serving with my cousin Brian, currently in law enforcement.
That's really cool. And what's on the other side over there?
It's a military stone for my family's military service and friends. The Holts have had somebody in every conflict since World War I. Starting with my great-great-grandfather Eugene in World War I, his brother in World War I, my grandfather in World War II, his brother in World War II, my father in Korea, it's 1960, me in Korea in 1980s, my sister in the first Gulf War, and my cousin in the Afghanistan campaign.